Well, the problem of integration became rather acute in Kentucky during my administration. We'd had the examples of Mississippi and Alabama in particular, but the governors of Kentucky have all been rather civil rights minded. After the 1954 decision requiring the integration of schools, I think Chandler was governor at the time. No, Weatherby was governor at that time in Kentucky, and Weatherby said, we will obey the mandate of the court. We will obey the Constitution and the court decision. Chandler came along, was the next governor, and Chandler, while he was not a great advocate for integration, he was not a George Wallace or a Ross Barnett. You know, he went along, and then I came along, succeeded Chandler, and at that time we were having sit-ins in Kentucky, particularly in Louisville. The blacks couldn't go into a restaurant, you know, that served white people, and could not go to a hotel, could not even go to a restroom in a hotel. And so the blacks were going into these places like the Blue Boar or the White Castle hamburger places, and they'd just go in there and they wouldn't serve them, so they would sit down, sit on the floor or sit on the stools, so long as the stools lasted. And that was the way the question came to a head in Kentucky. And so I had some meetings with the people in Louisville, and we really didn't get much done. But I remember the Blue Boar restaurant in Louisville, one of the better cafeteria-type restaurants. It was a focal point. The blacks thought they at least ought to be able to go through the counter and get their food and go in a corner and eat it, you know. And the Blue Boar owner was perfectly willing to do that, but the problem was, he says, if I do that, white people will quit coming into my restaurant. And so he was not willing to do it, but we finally made some progress in that respect. And then the blacks wanted me to recommend to the legislature that we would have integration in Kentucky in all public facilities. And I'm talking about hotels, parks, restaurants, and so on. And I took a reading of the legislature, and I was convinced, thoroughly convinced, we couldn't get that kind of a bill through the legislature. And so I didn't want to make the effort and have a failure, because that would be worse than nothing. So I issued what came to be known as, quote, the executive order. And that was that every facility in Kentucky that had to have a permit or a license from Kentucky would become integrated, would serve blacks and whites equally. Otherwise, we would deny them the license. And that covers, well, of course, to start with, it covered all state parks and state-owned facilities, lodges, and so on. But most restaurants, every restaurant for that matter, has to have a license from the state that their health facilities or sanitary facilities are sufficient, that they have been inspected and that they measure up to the requirements for health and sanitary conditions. Then too, most facilities in Kentucky, that's hotels anyway, in public facilities, amusement places and that sort of thing, they have to be inspected for fire hazards, you know. And so, when I said we would not issue a permit to anybody who had to have one from the state unless that facility was integrated, that pretty well covered the territory. And there was a big hue and cry about that, and it was a big issue in the Breathitt Louis Nunn campaign. By that time, I was approaching the